Welcome back, guys. Today, we're diving deep into the brutal and disturbing world of real pirates, the kind that didn't follow rules, showed no mercy, and left horror behind with every ship they boarded. Some of these facts are straight up insane. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see that. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let's uncover the dark truth behind piracy. Keelhauling. Keelhauling wasn't just a punishment, it was a slow-motion nightmare dragged across splintered wood and saltwater silence. Imagine being bound by ropes, your arms and legs tied so tightly you could barely move, then hoisted above the side of the ship as every crew member watches in cold silence. There's no last-minute plea, no mercy. You're lowered into the icy Black Sea, and then suddenly, you're yanked underneath the vessel. The water swallows you, but worse than the fear of drowning is what waits beneath the hull. The bottom of the ship is coated in razor-sharp barnacles, coral and filth, a jagged reef of splinters and teeth. As you're dragged from one side of the ship to the other, those barnacles tear at your flesh like thousands of hooked blades, flaying skin from muscle in long, agonizing strips. The rope rubs raw against your limbs, and the salt water surges into your wounds, making every nerve scream. You can't see, you can't breathe. You're bleeding into the sea, into the silence. If the sea doesn't kill you, if you don't drown in that swirling chaos, you're pulled up on the other side, gasping and bleeding, a barely living example of what happens when you defy pirate law. But many weren't pulled up at all. The ocean just kept them. Their bodies were left drifting in the ship's wake or tangled in the rigging below, slowly picked apart by the sea and forgotten by the living. Keelhauling wasn't about justice. It was about control. It was terror written into the very waters that pirates sailed, a ritual of fear to keep order in a lawless world. Every splash, every scream, every scarred survivor was a reminder. The ship doesn't forgive, and neither does the sea. Walking the plank. Walking the plank might sound like something out of a pirate movie, but for the poor souls forced to do it, it was a slow, psychological death sentence disguised as a twisted game. Unlike other executions, this wasn't quick or even fueled by rage. It was methodical, public. A spectacle of fear designed to break the victim long before the sea ever touched them. The crew would gather in a semicircle, their eyes cold, some even grinning. The condemned, often a traitor, prisoner, or unwanted captive, would be marched to the edge of a wooden plank extended out over open ocean. The silence was heavy. No screams, no mercy, just the wind and the creaking of wood beneath their feet. Sometimes their hands were bound, sometimes not. It didn't matter. The sharks circling below had learned to follow pirate ships, and they were already waiting. The victim would be forced to walk slowly forward, knowing with every step that death was coming, step by step, inch by inch. Behind them, pirates would prod with swords or muskets, sometimes singing, sometimes jeering, dragging out the agony like a grim ceremony. When the end came, when the final toe left the edge, there was no splash that mattered. Just the sea swallowing a body and the pirates turning away, already forgetting. It wasn't just about killing. It was about stripping away hope, about watching someone crumble, not from force, but from the weight of their own helplessness. Some victims tried to swim, others screamed. Most just fell silent, disappearing into blue nothingness. In the lawless world of pirates, walking the plank wasn't just execution, it was theatre, and fear was the script. Cannibal Raids. In the darkest corners of pirate history, beyond the gold and glory, are whispered tales of desperation, so savage they almost seem unreal. Cannibal raids. These weren't just battles for treasure, but for survival, waged by starving, fevered men who had long since lost the line between man and meat. When food ran out and the sea offered no fish, When weeks passed with nothing but mouldy crumbs and rats too fast to catch, some pirate crews turned on the only resource left: each other. It began with the dead, those who had succumbed to scurvy, dehydration, or battle. Bodies were stripped not for burial, but for sustenance. Flesh was carved, cooked over makeshift fires, and eaten in silence. No prayers, no shame, just survival chewing through morality. But it didn't always stop with the dead. In the most horrific cases, pirates raided coastal villages, not for gold, not for supplies, but for meat. Entire raids were planned simply to abduct and devour. Prisoners were seen as walking livestock. Some were kept alive in the ship's hold, growing weaker each day until they were chosen. It's said some captains even kept records of who would be next, treating human lives like salted pork inventory. The smell of roasted flesh, the screams below deck, the way the crew looked at newcomers with hollow hunger. It created an atmosphere where no one felt safe. Even the pirates themselves weren't spared if they became too weak to fight back. Brotherhood meant nothing. Hunger devoured loyalty. Cannibal raids are the side of piracy that history tries to forget. But the sea remembers, and some say, if you listen carefully when passing a remote island, you can still hear the echo of screams, drowned not by waves, but by the sound of teeth. Blackbeard's fused beard. Blackbeard, real name Edward Teach, wasn't just a pirate. He was a living nightmare. Not because of how many ships he took or how many men he killed, but because of how he turned himself into a symbol of pure terror. His beard, long, black, and braided into thick, greasy tendrils, became the centerpiece of a performance so terrifying it blurred the line between man and monster. Before battle, Blackbeard would lace his beard and hat with slow-burning fuses soaked in saltpeter. When lit, they would hiss and spit fire, wrapping his face in choking black smoke. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, glowed through the cloud like those of a demon rising from the sea. He didn't just appear on deck. He emerged from the smoke, swords in both hands, pistols slung across his chest like fangs. Many swore he was the devil himself. But beneath the legend was something even worse: obsession. Blackbeard fused his identity to fear until he became a walking myth. He cultivated horror not just in his enemies, but in his own crew. Some claimed he would shoot or maim his own men to remind them of his dominance. Others whispered that he practiced black magic, making pacts to keep death at bay, explaining why no bullets seemed to bring him down. When he finally died, after being shot 5 times and slashed across the body more than 20 times, his head was cut off and hung from the bow of the ship. But they say, after his corpse was thrown into the sea, it swam around the boat 3 times before sinking. Blackbeard didn't just die a legend. He became one, stitched together with smoke, steel, blood, and the sheer terror of that smouldering beard that made grown men drop their weapons in surrender before a single shot was fired. Marooning. Marooning was the pirate's coldest betrayal, an execution wrapped in patience. Unlike the instant brutality of a sword or musket shot, marooning was a slow, psychological decay, being left alone with your own thoughts, thirst, and the distant sound of waves that would never carry you home. When a pirate was marooned, they weren't just tossed overboard. They were taken to a remote, uninhabited island, some godforsaken patch of sand or jagged rock, and left. Sometimes with a pistol and 1 shot, sometimes with nothing but the clothes on their back. A jug of water if the crew was feeling generous. No food, no fire, no hope. It was a punishment reserved for mutineers, deserters, or cowards, men who had failed the pirate code or insulted the wrong captain. There was no trial, no last words, just the silence of the sea and the roar of the departing ship's sails. The moment the mast disappeared on the horizon, a new kind of death began. Marooned pirates didn't die quickly. First came the hunger, then thirst, sharp, clawing, hallucinatory. The heat by day scorched their skin raw, and the cold by night gnawed at their bones. Some went mad, carving words into rocks, singing to the wind, talking to ghosts. Others sat in silence, watching the tides like they were waiting for a miracle. But none came. Buzzards often arrived before ships ever did. And if one did appear in the distance, the marooned man had no way to signal, no fire, no flares, just a broken body waving into eternity. And still, perhaps the worst part was knowing that somewhere your crewmates were laughing, drinking, singing, alive, and you, forgotten, already a ghost. Buried alive as punishment. Among pirates, betrayal was the one sin no man came back from, and the punishment for it could be worse than death. One of the most chilling forms of retribution in the pirate world was being buried alive. Not as some myth or folklore, but as a brutal, drawn-out warning to every man watching. It wasn't always public. Sometimes it happened on deserted islands, sometimes in the deepest part of a hidden cove. The traitor, or sometimes just an unlucky scapegoat, would be dragged ashore, beaten until half-conscious, and forced into a shallow hole dug into sand or dirt. The crew would gather silently, watching as their former shipmate begged, wept, or cursed, already half-covered in earth. No ropes, no bindings, just gravity and time. Some were left with a pistol and a single bullet. Pirate mercy, if you could call it that. Most weren't. They were left to suffocate slowly under the weight of their own grave, to scream until their voice cracked, then faded beneath the soil. Their last breath wasn't taken. It was crushed. There were rumors of men who clawed their way out. None were ever seen again. Worse still, in some cases, the pirates would sing while they buried them. Slow, haunting sea shanties, mocking songs to drown out the muffled screams, the rising dirt, the sound of fingernails dragging along wooden planks or packed earth. It wasn't just to kill. It was to imprint terror into the minds of every crewmate still breathing. Being shot was quick. Being hanged, even faster. But being buried alive, that was for traitors. And pirates knew there was only one rule stronger than the captain's orders: never cross the Brotherhood. Pirate curses. Pirate curses weren't just ghost stories whispered on stormy nights. They were beliefs carved into the bones of every man at sea. To a pirate, curses were as real as the tides, and crossing one meant you weren't just risking death. You were calling it to follow you forever. Some curses were tied to stolen treasure, especially if taken from graves, temples, or rival captains. Pirates spoke of gold so cursed that it would rot the flesh of any man who touched it, cause madness among the crew, or even cause storms from the sky. Whole ships were said to vanish, not in battle or storm, but cursed into silence, sails full, crew missing, left adrift with untouched treasure and blood-stained decks. Others feared words, dying pirates who muttered their last breath into a curse meant to bind their killers to an eternity of torment. Some captains kept journals of these curses, trying to track the pattern of deaths, disappearances, and misfortunes that followed certain names or coins. There were whispers of cursed tattoos, symbols that marked a man for the sea to claim. Some pirates who wore them were found years later washed ashore, bloated and wide-eyed, hands clawing at their own throats. And then there were the cursed ships themselves, vessels said to be alive with the spirits of the damned. Sailors spoke of hearing footsteps at night, of shadows moving without light, of laughter echoing from empty cabins. Once boarded, these ships never let their new crew leave. To break a curse, that was nearly impossible. Some tried throwing the treasure back, cutting off cursed limbs, or chanting rituals under blood moons. But most pirates knew, once a curse found you, it followed you into the deep and beyond. Torture for mutiny. Mutiny was the ultimate betrayal on a pirate ship, a direct challenge to the captain's rule, and it was punished with a level of cruelty that made death seem like a gift. Pirates didn't just execute mutineers. They made examples of them, turning their punishment into a horror show designed to rot fear into the bones of anyone watching. The torture began long before the actual death. Some mutineers were hung by their ribs on iron hooks, alive, left to scream until they bled out or passed into shock. Others were tied spread-eagle to the mast, stripped of skin with red-hot irons, their flesh peeling under the tropical sun as insects swarmed to feed. One of the most feared punishments was the slow slice, a blade used not to kill, but to carve, inch by inch, over hours. Every cut was deliberate. Every scream, fuel for the watching crew to remember exactly what happened to traitors. The captain wouldn't even blink. Sometimes he smiled. In especially cruel cases, mutineers were nailed to the deck by their hands and feet, left for the crew to spit on, kick, or worse. Some were forced to eat gunpowder before being lit like human fuses. Others had their eyes gouged, their tongues cut out, their bodies tossed overboard while still alive, just maimed enough to sink slowly and feel it all. It wasn't about justice. It was power. Torture for mutiny wasn't just punishment. It was psychological warfare. A way to burn the message deep. The ship was his, and challenging that meant losing not just your life, but your dignity, your body, and your soul. One scream at a time. Drinking gunpowder rum. Among pirates, courage was often measured in what you were willing to swallow, and nothing proved your madness or loyalty quite like gunpowder rum. This wasn't just alcohol. It was a cocktail of death. A brutal mix of cheap rum and black powder scraped from the ship's cannons, swallowed like a dare, or a sentence. The rum itself was already lethal by normal standards, raw, unfiltered, and strong enough to make you forget your own name. But pirates would lace it with gunpowder to make it burn hotter, kick harder, and, according to legend, summon a kind of berserker state. Some said it gave them visions. Others claimed it made them fearless before battle. In truth, it just destroyed them from the inside. The sulfur and saltpeter in the gunpowder didn't mix well with human organs. It scorched the throat going down, left black stains on the tongue, and corroded the stomach like acid. Many pirates went blind, vomited blood, or dropped dead on the spot, frothing, twitching, convulsing, as the poison worked its way through their insides. And still, some begged for more. Captains sometimes forced the drink on captives, watching them break down into screaming, incoherent messes or fall unconscious in puddles of their own blood. Others used it as a twisted initiation ritual, drink or die. And either way, death was always near. The worst part, some pirates liked it. They grew addicted to the fire, to the chaos it lit inside them. They became walking corpses with burned-out throats and blackened teeth, men who laughed with cracked lips and stared through you like they'd already drowned, somewhere far beneath the surface of the sea. Sewing corpses into sails. When death came to a pirate ship, and it often did, it didn't always end with a burial at sea. In some of the most macabre corners of pirate history, there are whispers of a practice so grotesque it barely seems real. Sewing the dead into the sails. Sometimes it was punishment, sometimes desperation, but always horror. When cloth was scarce and battle had shredded their sails, pirates couldn't afford to slow down. So in blood-soaked desperation, they turned to the only material still available: human skin. Dead crewmates, enemies, even prisoners, stripped of clothing, cut open, and stitched into the canvas. It wasn't just about practicality. It was a statement. A ship that sailed on death. A flag of flesh that told anyone watching: this crew fears nothing, not even the boundaries between man and object. In other cases, it was symbolic. Pirates would sew the bodies of traitors into the sails as a warning, so their broken forms would flap in the wind, a grotesque puppet show for anyone who dared approach. Imagine sailing toward a ship and seeing faces stretched tight across canvas, eyes gouged, mouths frozen open by salt and wind. It wasn't a sail anymore. It was a curse carried on the wind. Some legends say these sails were cursed themselves, that storms followed them, that winds died in their presence, and that no matter how far they sailed, the screams of the sown would echo in the ropes. Whether born of necessity or madness, sewing corpses into sails blurred the line between tool and tomb, and turned the very thing that carried a pirate crew forward into a shroud made from their own dead. Eye of a Dead Man ritual. There was a ritual whispered among the most superstitious pirate crews, one that chilled even the most hardened killers to the bone. They called it the Eye of a Dead Man. It wasn't written in any logbook, and no captain ever admitted to using it, but those who witnessed it never forgot what they saw. When a pirate died, especially one who died badly, screaming, betrayed, or unfinished, his body wasn't always buried or tossed into the sea. Sometimes the crew would remove one eye from the corpse and preserve it in rum, brine, or oil. It became a kind of cursed talisman, a reminder of the dead man's final sight. The last thing he saw burned into the glassy orb. That eye would then be kept in a bottle or socketed into a crude idol, watching over the crew. But the ritual went deeper. Before battle or voyage, the crew would gather in a circle, passing the jar with the eye inside. Each man would look into it, hold its gaze, as if daring the dead to pass judgment. If the eye remained still, it meant the voyage would be safe. But if it shifted in the liquid, if it twitched, bobbed, or floated oddly, the crew believed someone on board was marked for death. In rare and terrifying moments, the eye would burst in its jar, without reason, without force. When that happened, the crew would stop everything. The dead man's curse had chosen someone. Panic set in. Men jumped ship. Some stabbed each other, thinking they'd been cursed. Others simply fell silent, knowing their time had come. And if you were the one the crew believed the eye had seen, you wouldn't live long enough to prove them wrong. Pirate ghost ships. Not every ship found drifting at sea is empty by chance. Some are the infamous ghost ships, vessels that sail without crew, without direction, and without explanation. Pirates feared them more than storms, more than navies, because these ships weren't just abandoned, they were cursed, soaked in something far older and darker than blood. The most feared tales tell of pirate crews who vanished overnight. Ships found days or weeks later, perfectly intact, sails full, cannons loaded, food untouched, but no crew, no signs of struggle, just silence, ropes swinging gently in the wind, footsteps on deck with no one to make them. Sometimes, strange symbols were carved into the wood. Sometimes, blood. Some say these ships were the result of betrayal, crews who murdered their captain, or captains who sold their souls for wind and speed. Others claim they carried cursed treasure, and the spirits bound to it consumed every living soul on board. The most disturbing were the ships that seemed aware. Sailors spoke of drifting too close and hearing voices, muffled laughter, whispering songs, the soft sound of cards being dealt in an empty cabin. A few who boarded came back broken, speaking in riddles or screaming until their hearts gave out. Most never came back at all. And worse, some ships came back more than once, found decades apart, unchanged, sails unstained by time, drifting across oceans like time forgot them. The same names, the same crests, as if they were sailing through something beyond this world. To pirates, ghost ships weren't just nautical legends. They were omens, warnings, a reminder that not everything that sails under the black flag stays dead, and some ships never stop sailing, even when everyone aboard is long gone. The Headless Pirate Legend. Among the oldest and most terrifying tales whispered in the pitch-black corners of pirate lore is that of the Headless Pirate. Not a ghost story meant for landlubbers, but a chilling, blood-soaked legend that even hardened buccaneers spoke of with lowered voices and darting eyes. The story begins, like many do, betrayal. A feared pirate captain, betrayed by his own crew in a midnight mutiny, was dragged across the deck and beheaded in front of the mast. His severed head was said to have grinned as it hit the planks, lips twitching, eyes still glaring. The crew, drunk on power, thought they had won. But that night, the wind stopped. The sea went still, and one by one, they began to vanish. According to legend, the captain's body never fell. It rose. Headless, bleeding, sword still gripped in hand. The ship turned into a floating tomb where the headless corpse hunted the traitors in silence. No screams, only the thud of boots and the wet sound of a blade finishing unfinished business. By morning, the ship drifted empty. Ever since, sailors across the world have reported sightings. A lone figure standing on the deck of a ship at sea, tall and unmoving, headless, with a cutlass in one hand and a lantern in the other. Ships that sail too close are said to vanish without a trace. Some claim to hear the sound of footsteps on their own decks at night, even while anchored in still water. The headless pirate isn't just a ghost. He's a warning that betrayal follows you even after death, that some captains never rest, and if you see that black ship on the horizon with no sails and no flag, turn back. Because if he finds you, he'll make sure your head never leaves your shoulders again. Forced amputations. On pirate ships, losing a limb wasn't always the result of battle. Sometimes it was the punishment, or worse, prevention. When infection spread or disobedience sparked chaos, the solution wasn't healing. It was removal, raw, brutal, and done with whatever blade was nearby. If a pirate's wound turned black or began to stink, there was no surgeon, no anesthetic, no second opinion. He'd be held down and the limb would be taken. A rusty cutlass, a carpenter's saw, whatever could tear through flesh and bone fast enough to beat the fever. Screams echoed through the hull like war drums. Blood pooled at their feet, and if the man survived, he was lucky. Most didn't. But not all amputations were medical. Some were punishment. Steal from the captain, lose a hand, strike a superior, off with a finger, an ear, even a tongue. Some captains made a game of it, carving the shape of the crime into the skin before cutting, and others used it to prevent betrayal. A crewman suspected of mutiny might wake up to find his sword hand missing, cauterized by fire so he wouldn't die, just never fight again. The worst stories tell of pirates who collected the severed limbs of enemies and rivals, kept them pickled in jars, or nailed them to the mast as trophies. A hand pointing outward, a foot swinging like a cursed wind chime in the storm, a message written in flesh. Amputation on a pirate ship wasn't just survival, it was theatre, a grotesque form of justice carved into bone. And for every wooden leg or hook hand you've seen in stories, remember, it didn't come from adventure, it came from pain. Living figureheads. At the prow of nearly every pirate ship stood a figurehead, those carved wooden women or beasts that sliced through the sea, meant to ward off bad luck and guide the vessel forward. But not all figureheads were made of wood. Some, according to the most unsettling legends, were alive, or at least they used to be. When pirates captured enemies or slaves and wanted to make an example more twisted than death, they'd chain the victim to the front of the ship, arms stretched out, body bound, eyes forced open to stare endlessly into the crashing waves. They became the ship's figurehead, lashed there for days, sometimes weeks, as the salt air peeled away skin and the sun turned their flesh to leather. Worse still, some captains believed that a living figurehead brought better luck, that a suffering soul at the front of the ship pleased the sea or frightened spirits away. So they kept them alive as long as possible. They'd feed them scraps, pour water down their throats, all just enough to keep their hearts beating, just enough to keep them screaming when storms came and waves slammed into their broken bodies. Many went mad long before they died, their minds drowned by wind and water. They'd babble, beg, or sing nonsense to the sea. Sailors swore the ship's course would change on its own when the figurehead whispered. Some even claimed that after death, the figurehead's mouth would still move, silently chanting curses with a jaw of splinters and teeth. Others believed the ship absorbed their soul, that the victim's torment fused with the wood, making the vessel itself alive and angry. To most, it was a myth. To those who saw a body nailed to the prow, head lolling with the waves, it was a nightmare they'd never forget. Black Spot Curse. To pirates, few things inspired more terror than receiving the black spot. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a man. It was a mark, a silent, chilling sentence of doom delivered by someone you trusted or feared. The black spot came as a crude coin, a torn piece of paper, or a scrap of cloth. It was always black, always circular, and always delivered in secret. Sometimes it was slipped under a door. Sometimes it was pressed into a man's palm mid-handshake. Sometimes it just appeared in his food, floating like an omen. But the message was always the same. You've been marked. It meant your time was up. A warning from your crew, from another captain, or worse, from a secret pirate council. It was a symbol of betrayal, mutiny, revenge, or debt unpaid. And once it was given, there was no escape. Men who received the black spot often didn't sleep again. Paranoia set in. They'd start checking every corner, snapping at shadows, turning their cannons on birds. Some went mad before anyone even touched them. Others were dead within a day, poisoned, stabbed, tossed overboard, or hung from their own mast. There were darker tales, though. Some claimed the black spot wasn't just a threat, but a curse, that whoever received it was doomed to die no matter what, even if they fled across oceans. Ships would sink around them. Fires would start without spark. Storms would rise from calm seas and drag them screaming into the abyss. And the worst part? No one ever saw it coming. The hand that gave it was often a friend, a crewmate, maybe even someone smiling. Because in the world of pirates, death didn't always come with a sword. Sometimes it came with a silent little circle and a promise you couldn't outrun. Hanging in chains. When pirates were caught, some were hanged and forgotten. But the most feared, the most hated, or the most legendary, they were given a fate far more gruesome, hanging in chains. This wasn't just execution. It was humiliation stretched out across days, weeks, and even months. After death by hanging, the pirate's body wasn't buried. It was stripped, bound in iron shackles, and suspended from a tall gibbet, a cage-like frame of metal, often near a harbour or along a major shipping route. There, the corpse would swing in the wind, rotting in full view of every sailor, every merchant, every child passing by. The purpose was simple: fear. This was the Empire's way of saying, this is what happens when you challenge the law. The flies swarmed. Birds pecked out eyes and entrails. Storms soaked the flesh until it sloughed off like wet parchment. Sometimes, bones clattered in the wind like wind chimes from hell. But even worse were the tales of pirates who were hanged alive in chains, left to die slowly, starved and exposed to the elements, screaming for days before finally going still. Seagulls would land on their shoulders, plucking bits from living bodies, while the condemned man swung silently between ocean and sky. Some pirates believed the soul couldn't move on until the body fell, so to be chained in death meant to be trapped, cursed, doomed to haunt the coastlines forever, your spirit dangling from the same iron where your flesh once rotted. Even the bravest pirates, men who would charge a fortress without blinking, would pale at the sight of a chained skeleton swaying in the breeze, its empty sockets staring as if still watching the ships sail by. Pirate execution docks. Execution docks weren't just places of death. They were theatres of fear, where the final act of a pirate's life played out before jeering crowds and roaring tides. These grim stages sat on the edges of harbours, close enough to smell the salt air, and far enough that the screams didn't echo into polite society. In places like London's execution dock in Wapping, pirates were dragged in chains from filthy prisons, paraded through the streets as drunk mobs threw rotten food and curses. Their destination, a noose hanging from a gallows built right above the tide. But unlike a quick hanging, pirate executions were meant to drag. They used a short drop, not long enough to break the neck, just enough to make the condemned suffocate. Their legs kicked, faces purpled, tongues lolled as they dangled there for minutes, sometimes longer, choking slowly in front of a crowd thirsty for revenge. The more feared the pirate, the slower the execution. And then came the tide test. Once dead, the body would be left hanging until it had been washed over by 3 full tides. A ritual meant to ensure the sea itself witnessed the death. Only then could the body be removed. But even then, the punishment wasn't always over. Some corpses were tarred, drenched in black pitch to preserve them, and hung in iron cages along riverbanks or harbour entrances. There they would hang for years, slowly decaying as ships passed beneath, the sun melting their skin, the rain peeling away their face. To the authorities, execution docks were justice. To pirates, they were a curse. A warning carved into every creaking beam and rope. No matter how far you sail, this is how it ends, swinging above the sea you once ruled. Blood oaths on bones. In the lawless world of pirates, loyalty wasn't written in ink, it was written in blood. And the most feared form of that loyalty was the blood oath on bones, a ritual soaked in superstition, secrecy, and savagery. When a crew needed to swear unbreakable allegiance before a mutiny, a raid, or the hiding of cursed treasure, they'd gather in the belly of the ship or deep within a sea cave. A human bone, usually a finger, a rib, or even a skull, was placed in the center of a crude circle drawn in ash or salt. It wasn't always from an enemy. Sometimes it came from a dead crewmate, someone they respected. Sometimes not. Each pirate would cut their palm with a rusted blade and let blood drip onto the bone. One by one, in complete silence, they'd swear their oath, never to speak of what they knew, never to betray what they'd done. The blood would mix, staining the bone dark. It was then wrapped in cloth, sealed in oil, and hidden somewhere no one but the oath-bound crew could find. But if someone broke that oath, that's when the true terror began. It was believed the bone would curse the traitor, marking them for death. Their ship would sink. Their body would rot before death. They'd see the face of the dead man in their dreams, waking up choking on salt water in a dry bed. And eventually, one by one, the other oath-takers would hunt them down, slowly, deliberately. Not just to kill them, but to cut out the part that betrayed them. Some say the bones still exist, buried beneath coastal sands, bricked behind harbour taverns, sealed in barrels aboard wrecks no diver dares approach. And the blood? It's still there, waiting, remembering. Boiling in oil. Among the darkest punishments ever whispered through the halls of pirate history, boiling in oil was not only real, it was personal. It wasn't used often, not because it was forbidden, but because it was reserved for the most hated souls, traitors, spies, men who broke sacred pirate codes. When a crew chose oil, they weren't just killing someone. They were making them suffer in front of God, the sea, and every screaming witness. It started with preparation. A large cauldron or iron barrel was filled with animal fat, oil, or pitch, then hoisted over a fire, often lit right on the deck of the ship or on shore, in full view of the crew. As the flames rose and the liquid began to bubble, the condemned would be dragged in, beaten, stripped, and chained. Every second before the drop was psychological torture. The heat, the smell, the sound of the oil snapping like it was hungry. Some victims begged, others cursed. A few went silent, broken long before the boiling ever touched them. And then came the plunge. The body didn't go in all at once, sometimes just the hands, the feet, the face. Other times they were lowered in slowly, so the screams would rise in waves as the flesh peeled and bubbled, falling away from muscle like wax off a candle. The oil didn't just cook, it invaded, filling lungs, eyes, and ears, turning the body into a blistered, twitching horror. The execution could last minutes or much longer, depending on how cruel the crew wanted to be. But even after death, the punishment wasn't over. Some pirates would display what was left: blackened limbs, charred skulls, nailed to the mast, or hung in nets as a warning. Others would toss the remains into the sea, letting the sharks feed on what the flames hadn't already claimed. Boiling in oil wasn't justice. It was rage turned ritual. And on a pirate ship, it meant one thing: you did something so foul that even hell needed help punishing you. Drawing and quartering. If you were a pirate and they wanted to make sure no one ever followed in your footsteps, drawing and quartering was the fate they'd reserve for you. It wasn't just about killing. It was about erasing you, piece by piece, publicly, slowly, horrifically. The condemned would first be paraded through a jeering crowd, stripped and shackled, often bloodied and bruised from days of torture. Then came the drawing, being tied to a horse or dragged by ropes through the dirt, rocks, and filth until skin was flayed raw and bones cracked like twigs. This alone could kill a man, but if he survived, the real show began. At the place of execution, he was tied spread-eagle, arms and legs roped to 4 horses or posts. Sometimes the limbs were simply hacked off by axe, but in the most gruesome displays, the horses were whipped until they ran in opposite directions, tearing the man apart. Not instantly. Ligaments strained, joints dislocated, skin stretched until it split. The body didn't break cleanly. It ripped like meat from bone, tendons snapping like ropes. The screams echoed for miles, but it didn't end with death. Each severed limb was sent to a different city, or nailed to a dock or a port, anywhere sailors might pass by and see what happened to traitors, mutineers, or pirate kings who dared defy the crown. Heads were boiled and spiked, often displayed in iron cages, mouths still twisted in terror. Their remains didn't get a grave. They became warnings, scattered across the coasts like cursed relics. To be drawn and quartered was to be unmade. You didn't just die. You were turned into a message. And that message was clear. No one is too feared, too famous, or too lucky to escape the wrath of the noose and the horses. Cannibal Island legends. There were islands marked on no maps, spoken of only in murmurs, cursed in drunken whispers, where pirates claimed no man should ever anchor. These were the Cannibal Islands, places where the trees whispered, the birds fell silent, and the sand was stained with blood. Some said they were real. Others said they were the hallucinations of half-starved crews. But the stories all shared one chilling thread. Men went in and were eaten. According to legend, these islands were inhabited not just by tribes, but by fallen pirates themselves, shipwrecked men who, in desperation, had turned to flesh. Over the years, they lost their language, their humanity, and even their names. They wore bones as jewelry, skulls as masks. They painted their bodies in red and black, blending with the jungle, waiting in silence for the next ship to stumble too close. Some captains told of entire crews vanishing within hours of landing. Campfires left burning, blood trails leading into the trees. Others spoke of finding their crewmates' limbs nailed to trees, their hearts roasted on spits, their heads stacked in ceremonial piles. One tale even described a survivor who escaped with his tongue cut out, his body covered in teeth marks, his mind shattered. Worse still were the rumors that some pirate crews willingly left their enemies there. They'd strand mutineers or prisoners on these cursed shores, knowing full well what would happen. Some watched from their ships as figures emerged from the trees, thin, wild-eyed, dragging blades made of bone. They didn't run. They just waited, like the island itself was hungry. To this day, sailors swear there are islands in the Caribbean, in the South Pacific, where the jungle listens, where the sand sinks under your feet, and if you hear drumming from deep within the trees, it's already too late. Feeding prisoners to sharks. Some pirate captains didn't just kill their enemies, they fed them. Not to their crew, not to the fire, but to the cold, hungry black below. Feeding prisoners to sharks wasn't a threat. It was an example, a lesson carved into the sea with blood, thrashing limbs, and bone. The ritual began with silence. The ship would stop. The crew would gather. The prisoner, sometimes a rival, sometimes a mutineer, sometimes just unlucky, was bound, beaten, and dragged to the edge of the deck. The ocean below would churn faintly, as if it already knew. Sharks had followed pirate ships for miles, drawn by the smell of blood, the scraps tossed overboard, and the occasional human feast. Sometimes the pirates cut the prisoner first, deep, deliberate wounds to let the scent run like ink in the water. Other times they'd tie weights to their legs, just enough to keep them floating helplessly beneath the surface, unable to swim or scream. And then, with a final shove or laugh, they were thrown in. What followed wasn't quick. The ocean would go still for a moment. Then the shadows arrived, dark shapes circling, curious. Then came the strike, a burst of foam, a scream, limbs vanishing in flashes of white teeth, blood blooming like smoke. And sometimes, if the pirates were in a cruel mood, they'd toss in a second man before the frenzy ended. To pirates, this wasn't just punishment. It was entertainment, a game. Some even placed bets on how long the prisoner would last, or which part would be bitten off first. Others claimed the sharks grew familiar, learned the sound of the ship, followed it like pets that fed only on screams. To this day, sailors whisper of places where the sea smells wrong, where the water never sits calm, and where shadows follow you, waiting for a splash. Skeleton crews, literal. When pirates spoke of skeleton crews, it wasn't always just about low manpower. It was literal. There are stories, whispered in port taverns and cursed coastlines, of ships manned by the dead, crews of bones lashed to the wheel, jaws grinning eternally, empty sockets fixed on the horizon. These weren't ghost ships exactly. They were worse. Legend has it that during long voyages through cursed waters, some pirate captains, drunk on power or madness, refused to let their dead crewmates go. Whether from superstition, desperation, or black magic, they'd preserve the corpses and force the living crew to keep them working, tied to ropes, propped up at the cannons, seated at the mess table, rotting bodies treated like regular men. And over time, flesh gave way to bone. Some captains believed that if a crewman died in service, their soul remained bound to the ship, that leaving their body behind was disrespectful, dangerous. Others used the dead to scare enemies, sailing into battle with skeletal figures lining the railings, jaws wired open in eternal screams. But the darkest tales speak of entire ships where everyone was dead, yet the vessel still moved. No wind in the sails, no hands on the wheel, just skeletons frozen in their duties, raising anchors, swabbing decks, cleaning pistols long since rusted shut. Some ships would dock silently at night, offloading crates without a sound, then vanish by morning. And if a living man ever set foot on one of these vessels, they say he'd vanish too. His body found later, bones polished, clothes intact, a smile stitched across his face like he'd joined the crew. Forever. Possessed compasses. Among all a pirate's tools, the compass was sacred. It meant direction, survival, treasure. But some compasses weren't made to guide. Some were made to curse. Stories tell of possessed compasses, tools that pointed not north, but toward madness, betrayal, and death. These weren't ordinary instruments. They were often found in the wreckage of sunken ships, sealed in blood-stained chests, or clutched in the skeletal hands of captains who'd vanished from history. To the untrained eye, they looked normal, but when used, the needle would wobble, tremble, then lock on a direction that made no sense, pointing straight into storms, into reefs, into black, open nothingness. The crews that followed them found ruin. Some would circle the same island for weeks, starving as the compass led them in loops. Others would crash into jagged rocks at full speed, the compass screaming toward its mark, while every other tool on board showed clear skies and calm tides. A few crews vanished entirely, and the compass would wash ashore alone, untouched by salt, still ticking, still pointing somewhere. But it wasn't just the misdirection that terrified sailors, it was the behavior. These compasses moved when no one touched them. They spun wildly when held near certain men, as if reacting to guilt or fear. Some would shatter mirrors when opened. Others would whisper. Yes, whisper. Pirates who owned these cursed tools reported hearing voices when they held them at night. Soft, pleading voices. Promises of gold. Warnings of betrayal. Some went mad trying to decode what the compass wanted. One man was found dead with the needle buried in his chest, his blood forming an arrow across the deck. They say the sea never lies, but some compasses do. And when they do, they always lead you where you were never meant to go. Drowned alive in barrels. Sometimes, death on a pirate ship wasn't swift. It was slow, soaked, and silent. One of the cruelest punishments whispered in hushed tones was being drowned alive in barrels, a method used not only to execute, but to erase a man completely. It began with betrayal, disobedience, or just bad luck. The accused would be bound hand and foot, gagged, and shoved into a watertight barrel, usually one that had once held rum, gunpowder, or brine. The lid would be nailed shut as the crew watched, some laughing, others turning away, pretending not to hear the muffled cries inside. Then came the water. Buckets would be poured in slowly through a small hole or crack, just enough to raise the level inch by inch. Or worse, the entire barrel was lowered into the ocean and let float, bobbing like a cruel buoy, with a man still screaming inside. The water crept up. His breathing space shrank. The sounds turned from shouting, to coughing, to silence. Sometimes they let the barrel sink on its own. Other times they weighted it, so it vanished below the surface with a final gurgle, bubbles rising like the soul trying to escape. No ceremony, no grave, just a sealed tomb sinking into blackness. Some captains used this as a warning, rolling sealed barrels across the deck before a crew. They'd knock softly. From inside, scratching. Maybe even a voice, barely audible. And the worst stories? They speak of opening one of those barrels months later, the body still curled, mouth open, fingernails shredded from clawing at the inside. Eyes wide, as if he had drowned watching himself die. Disease-infested ships. Some pirate ships weren't feared for their cannons or crews, but for what lurked inside them. Floating tombs cloaked in tattered sails, these were the disease-infested ships, vessels that reeked of death long before they were seen, carrying plagues more deadly than any sword. They often drifted aimlessly, their helms unmanned, their flags faded to black. No movement on deck, no voices, just silence, and the occasional creak of the hull as the sea lapped at its rotting bones. Sailors foolish enough to board found horror waiting. Entire crews lying where they fell, twisted in agony, skin blackened with sores, eyes open and oozing. The dead filled hammocks, mess halls, even the rigging, some having died trying to climb away from the stench below. The cause? No one ever knew for certain, Some blamed rats. Others said cursed treasure brought illness from distant lands, and a few whispered it wasn't natural at all, that these ships had sailed into something they shouldn't have, somewhere beyond maps, and returned carrying death like a passenger. Worse, some of these ships were still alive, with 1 or 2 infected pirates barely clinging to breath, coughing blood onto the deck, muttering nonsense, and trying to welcome new visitors aboard. One tale speaks of a man who boarded a derelict ship and found a logbook written in blood, each page more frantic than the last, ending with a single line scratched so deep into the wood it left a groove. "It's inside me." Ports refused to let these vessels dock. Navy ships would spot them and burn them from a distance, afraid of what might crawl out. But sometimes, the sea brought them ashore anyway, and curious fools would climb aboard. And those who did, they always brought something back. Cursed treasure maps. Not every map leads to riches, some lead to ruin. Among pirates, there are legends of cursed treasure maps, parchments inked in madness, blood, or something far worse. Maps that promise unimaginable wealth, but demand a toll no man expects to pay. They look like normal maps at first, weathered, torn, edges burned, landmarks you almost recognize. But the more you follow them, the more wrong the world begins to feel. Islands shift, stars don't match the sky. Compass needles twitch and spin. The ocean grows quiet, too quiet, as if the sea itself is holding its breath. Crews that chase these maps always change. Some become obsessed, refusing sleep, redrawing the map over and over until it consumes every thought. Others begin to see things. Shadows watching from the sails, figures standing just behind them at the wheel. One pirate claimed the map spoke to him, whispering the location of the treasure and the names of the men who would try to steal it from him. He killed them all before they reached land. In some tales, the treasure is real, but it's guarded by things that shouldn't exist. Shipwrecks that bleed, statues that scream, sands that swallow you whole. Other stories end at the X, with nothing there, only the sound of digging, and then silence. As if the map never wanted you to find gold, only to get you alone, far from help. And the worst part, even if you burn the map, tear it, sink it, it returns, folded neatly, in your coat, on your pillow, nailed to the mast, because some treasure isn't meant to be found, and some maps don't lead to fortune, they lead to you. Flag of the damned. Every pirate flew a flag, but some flew one that didn't signal fear, it signaled damnation. The flag of the damned wasn't just cloth and thread, it was a cursed emblem, soaked in blood, stitched with bone needles, and flown only by those who had nothing left to lose, and nothing human left inside. Legends say this flag was blacker than night, with no skull, no hourglass, just a bleeding red slash or a stitched eye that never blinked. Some versions were made from human skin, others inked in the blood of mutinous crewmates. It was never flown high. It rose when the slaughter began, when no quarter would be given, when mercy had drowned and madness took the helm. Ships that saw it didn't run, they froze. Because the flag of the damned didn't just mean battle, it meant ritual. Crews beneath that flag were said to chant as they boarded, to wear the faces of previous victims as masks. Survivors from such attacks were rare and broken. They spoke of captains with sewn lips, of crews that howled instead of shouted, of ships that vanished afterward like they'd never existed. And worse, some say the flag flies itself, that in cursed waters it appears out of nowhere, fluttering from a mast that wasn't there a second ago. Ships that spot it often go silent soon after. No distress call, no trace, just wreckage found weeks later, and sometimes the flag, perfectly intact, waiting to be claimed by the next damned soul. To fly it was to abandon all humanity. To see it was to feel the weight of your death before a single shot was fired. Cursed pirate coins. Not all treasure brings fortune. Some coins, especially those looted from sacred temples, tombs, or blood-soaked chests, carry more than gold. They carry curses. And among pirates, none were more feared than the cursed pirate coins. Small, ancient, and soaked in death. They looked ordinary at first. Dull, weathered, sometimes marked with symbols no one could read. But the signs came fast. A man who stole such a coin might begin to waste away, eating like a beast, but growing thinner by the day. Others went mad, screaming of shadows in their hammocks, hearing whispers inside locked chests. Some just dropped dead, clutching the coin so tightly it left an imprint in their cold blue fingers. Crews that stole large cursed hoards didn't last long. Ships sank in calm waters. Storms appeared out of nowhere. Sails tore, rats swarmed, food rotted overnight, and worst of all, the treasure always vanished. Hidden, thrown overboard, or buried in panic, only to be found again by the next unlucky fools. Some captains tried to melt the coins. They wouldn't burn. Others tossed them into the sea, only to find the same coins back in their pockets or stacked neatly beside their bed. One sailor claimed he tore open his own chest with a broken bottle trying to remove a coin he swore had entered his body. Entire ships have vanished chasing cursed treasure maps, lured by promises of gold that turned into doom. And the coins, they still turn up, at auctions, in washed-up wreckage, in the hands of the greedy and the desperate. But every pirate knows, if a coin feels too cold, if its weight seems wrong, and if the air around it goes still, you don't keep it. You run,